Hey there, welcome back. Get comfortable, settle in, and stay with me until the very end, because today's story might explain something you felt but never quite had the words for. There is a quiet kind of power that lives in the presence of someone with a deeply empathic nature. A force that doesn't need drama, doesn't need yelling, doesn't need manipulation to completely shift the dynamic of a relationship, especially when that person is paired with someone who struggles with closeness and tends to pull away. This kind of empath doesn't break someone down through arguments. Instead, they quietly dismantle a guarded ego through nothing more than their steady presence, their deep insight, and their unshakable authenticity. The first sign that a deeply empathic person is quietly unsettling a closed-off partner is their calm, unbothered self-respect. Someone who avoids closeness is usually used to people chasing after them, questioning their silence, trying to fix them, or begging for a little more closeness. But a true empath simply doesn't play that game. They honor themselves first. When the other person goes cold, the empath doesn't panic or spiral. They simply pull back too. They don't try to force their way into emotional closeness. Instead, they quietly observe. And that alone shakes the avoidant person to their core, because they're so used to being the one who controls emotional distance. When they realize they can't push this person into begging, into pleasing, into shrinking themselves smaller and smaller, something inside them quietly cracks. It isn't loud, but it's undeniable. It's the slow realization that their usual tactics, the detachment, the silence, the withdrawal, no longer hold any power over this particular person. The empath sees it all clearly and simply doesn't chase, and that lack of reaction hits far deeper than any argument ever could. The second sign is the empath's emotional clarity. People with this kind of empathic depth are naturally intuitive. They can sense what someone is going through even when nothing has been said out loud. When they're with someone avoidant, they often understand that person's patterns better than the avoidant person understands themselves. The avoidant might try to play it cool, hiding behind silence, humor, or a kind of intellectual distance. But the empath sees straight through all of it. What truly shakes them isn't just being seen. It's being seen with painful accuracy. People who avoid closeness often build their entire identity around being emotionally untouchable, unreadable, mysterious. But when an empath looks them in the eye and gently says, "You're not distant because you don't care, you're distant because you're scared," it leaves them stunned. There's nowhere left to hide. The ego, which thrives on control and emotional concealment, cracks wide open under that kind of precise, compassionate truth. And it doesn't even feel like an attack. It feels like an invasion of emotional accuracy. The avoidant person might brush it off on the outside, but inside they're shaken. Someone has read them completely and still hasn't run away. That isn't ego boosting. That's ego dismantling. The third sign is the empath's refusal to be emotionally manipulated. People who avoid closeness often use withdrawal, inconsistency, or emotional unavailability as a quiet way to maintain control in their relationships. They create confusion and leave the other person caught in an endless loop of second-guessing themselves. But a true empath simply doesn't fall into that trap. They don't beg for clarity. They don't spiral into overthinking everything. They simply recognize the emotional pattern for what it is, and then they walk right past it. When the avoidant person goes cold, the empath doesn't argue back. They quietly observe and then they decide. And when they decide to pull their own energy back, the avoidant person feels it like a sudden vacuum. Suddenly, their usual sense of emotional superiority is gone. The power they thought they had simply disappears, and that eats away at their sense of self. Their identity is often built on being the one in control, on being the one who cares less, on appearing emotionally untouchable. But when the empath stops reacting and starts reclaiming their own energy instead, the entire dynamic flips. Now the avoidant person is the one left wondering why their usual tools suddenly stopped working, wondering why this person isn't fighting to keep them around. That silence, that calm stepping back, ends up being louder than any outburst ever could be. The fourth sign is the way the empath's healing presence quietly stirs up shame in someone avoidant. People who avoid closeness often carry deep, hidden wounds, feelings of unworthiness, fears of truly being seen, and a quiet belief that love always comes with a painful cost attached. They bury all of this beneath independence, sarcasm, and tall emotional walls. But when they're around a genuine empath, something unusual begins to happen. They start to feel safe and unsafe at the exact same time. Safe because the empath is gentle, non-judgmental, and emotionally open. Unsafe because that very openness begins stirring up everything they've spent years locking away. Suddenly, their usual emotional shields start to break down. The empath never tries to fix them outright, but their presence alone becomes a kind of emotional mirror. And that reflection brings up shame. Shame for being emotionally unavailable. Shame for the constant push and pull behavior. Shame for running from the very love they secretly crave. The ego simply cannot hold its shape under that kind of soft, steady energy. The avoidant person might even start sabotaging the connection just to escape that discomfort. But deep down, they know this person saw them clearly, accepted them fully, and still chose themselves in the end. That stings in a way their ego was never prepared for. There's a single moment that changes everything in the dynamic between someone avoidant and a deeply empathic partner. It isn't the argument, it isn't the silence, it isn't even the breakup itself. It's the moment the empath emotionally detaches with peace instead of pain. Quietly, clearly, completely. That is the fifth and final sign, and for the avoidant person's ego, it's often the most devastating moment of all. Because up until that point, the avoidant person has usually relied, often without fully realizing it, on a familiar emotional pattern. Distance followed by reconciliation. Withdrawal followed by pursuit. Confusion followed by forgiveness. The cycle becomes familiar, predictable, almost safe in its own dysfunctional way. Even when the relationship feels unstable, the avoidant person unconsciously trusts one thing above everything else: that the empath will stay. Not necessarily because they believe they deserve that loyalty, but simply because they've grown accustomed to it. They've learned, consciously or not, that no matter how distant they become, no matter how inconsistent their behavior gets, the empath keeps trying to understand them, keeps trying to repair the connection, keeps looking beneath the coldness for the wounded person hiding underneath. And in the beginning, the empath often does exactly that. They see the pain behind the avoidance. They see the fear beneath the detachment. They see the frightened child still living inside those walls. They sense the vulnerability hiding under all that pride, silence, and emotional withdrawal. This is exactly what makes the connection between these two types feel so intense at first. The empath doesn't just see behavior, they see the emotional truth underneath that behavior. They recognize wounds that other people overlook entirely. They feel compassion in moments where most people would only feel frustration. And because of that depth, they often stay far longer than most people ever would. The avoidant person begins to feel emotionally safe in a way they may have never experienced before. For perhaps the first time in their life, someone isn't immediately rejecting them for their emotional inconsistency. Someone is genuinely trying to understand them instead of punishing them for it. But what so many people in this position fail to realize is that the empath's compassion was never weakness. It was depth. And depth has its limits when it keeps being met with emotional avoidance instead of real accountability. At first, the empath tells themselves the distance is only temporary. They believe patience will eventually help. They believe their love will soften the walls over time. They believe consistency will slowly build trust. They believe understanding will eventually create real openness. And sometimes, for brief flickers, it actually seems true. The avoidant person opens up slightly. They become affectionate again. They reveal small flashes of vulnerability. They express feelings indirectly. They pull closer after a period of distance. These moments become emotionally intoxicating for the empath because they feel like proof that progress is finally happening. Proof that the love underneath is real despite all the confusion. Proof that healing is genuinely possible. But then the cycle returns all over again. The distance creeps back in. Communication shifts. The emotional walls go right back up. The avoidant person withdraws again right after a moment of real intimacy. The empath feels abandoned all over again. And once more, they try to fix something they never broke in the first place. This is where a slow kind of exhaustion begins to set in. Not physical exhaustion, but soul-deep exhaustion. The kind that comes from spending too long trying to maintain emotional closeness with someone who genuinely fears closeness itself. Over time, the empath begins carrying the entire emotional labor of the relationship on their own shoulders. They become hyper-aware of every mood shift, every silence, every subtle change in energy. They monitor every single interaction carefully, trying desperately to preserve the connection while avoiding anything that might trigger withdrawal. They learn how to comfort, reassure, understand, and forgive, again and again. But somewhere in all of that, something quietly dangerous starts happening. The empath slowly begins disappearing from their own center. Their needs become secondary. Their emotional reality gets minimized. Their intuition becomes overworked. Their nervous system stays trapped in a constant cycle of uncertainty. And yet they stay. Why? Because true empaths don't give up easily. When they love deeply. When they commit emotionally, they invest completely. When they see real potential in someone, they hold on to it with extraordinary endurance. But eventually, even the deepest well of compassion reaches its limit. And contrary to what a lot of people assume, that breaking point rarely arrives through anger. It arrives through clarity. And that's exactly what makes it so powerful. The empath eventually comes to a painful but transformative realization. They aren't loving a whole person anymore. They're loving potential. They're loving glimpses, fragments, brief moments of emotional availability surrounded by long, lonely stretches of emotional absence. And suddenly, they start seeing the pattern itself instead of just the rare exceptions. That changes absolutely everything, because as long as the empath stays focused on those isolated moments of vulnerability, they remain emotionally tethered to hope. But once they begin recognizing the larger behavioral cycle for what it really is, that hope slowly dissolves into clear awareness. They stop asking, "How do they feel about me?" and start asking instead, "Why does this relationship require me to abandon myself completely?" That single question marks the beginning of real emotional freedom. The avoidant person often senses this shift happening before a single word is even spoken. Something in the empath changes on an energetic level. They stop over-explaining themselves. They stop chasing. They stop desperately trying to reconnect after every single withdrawal. Their emotional intensity quietly softens, not because they've stopped caring, but because they're finally beginning to accept reality as it actually is. And reality becomes very hard to ignore once you truly see it clearly. The empath realizes that understanding someone's wounds doesn't obligate them to remain wounded by those same wounds forever. They realize love simply cannot survive on empathy alone. They realize real relationships require genuine participation from both people involved. And perhaps most painfully of all, they realize that some people would rather lose love entirely than face themselves honestly. This is the exact moment the avoidant person's ego starts to feel destabilized, because the entire dynamic is shifting in a way they don't fully understand yet. For so long, emotional control existed purely through distance. The avoidant person unconsciously held power simply by staying emotionally hard to reach. The empath compensated by moving closer, trying harder, loving deeper. That imbalance became completely normalized over time, but now the empath is no longer participating in that same emotional dance. And that's genuinely terrifying for the avoidant person, not because they suddenly stopped caring, but because they realize the connection might actually end. Really end. Not as a temporary pause, not as another dramatic cycle, but permanently. And what shocks the avoidant person most is the way the empath finally leaves. Not with revenge, not with cruelty, not with emotional chaos, but with genuine peace. That peace becomes almost unbearable to their ego because it communicates something words alone never could. I no longer need your validation in order to choose myself. That single realization completely destroys the illusion of emotional control. The avoidant person expected anger. They expected pleading. They expected one more emotional pursuit, one more attempt to fix things. Instead, they encounter calm, steady detachment. And calm detachment forces real self-reflection in a way that conflict never can, because arguments allow room for distraction. Defensiveness allows room for avoidance. Blame allows room to escape. But a peaceful departure leaves absolutely nowhere left to hide. The avoidant person suddenly faces a terrifying realization. This person saw everything clearly all along. They saw the fear. They saw the inconsistency. They saw the emotional walls. They saw every act of self-sabotage. They saw all the patterns. And despite seeing every bit of it, they stayed and loved anyway, right up until staying would have meant betraying themselves. That realization tends to stay with the avoidant person long after the relationship has ended, because true empaths leave differently than most people do. They don't just leave physically, they emotionally release the attachment entirely. And once that happens, the whole energy between them changes completely. The avoidant person feels it almost immediately. The messages stop carrying any emotional urgency. The conversations stop holding any hidden hope. The empath no longer tries to pull intimacy out of someone who simply isn't emotionally available. The emotional doorway quietly, gently closes. For the avoidant ego, this can feel deeply disorienting, because many people who avoid closeness unconsciously believe that others will always remain emotionally available to them, no matter how inconsistently they behave. Not necessarily out of arrogance, but because repeated cycles taught them that withdrawal never actually led to permanent loss before. Until now. Now the empath is genuinely gone emotionally, and suddenly the avoidant person begins revisiting old memories obsessively. They remember the patience they once received, the understanding, the emotional safety, the compassion, the depth of that connection. Things they once took completely for granted now become painfully visible in their absence. This is one of the cruel little ironies of avoidance. Emotional clarity often arrives far too late. When closeness is right there available, fear takes over completely. When closeness finally disappears, longing suddenly awakens. The avoidant person starts recognizing exactly what the empath brought into their life: the warmth, the acceptance, the intimacy, the effort, the steady emotional presence they quietly depended on while resisting it at the very same time. And for many people in this position, this realization creates a kind of internal collapse of identity. Because avoidant coping mechanisms rely so heavily on emotional distancing, they survive by minimizing attachment, intellectualizing their emotions, suppressing vulnerability, and maintaining a sense of control through detachment. But once the empath leaves peacefully, those old defenses simply stop working. Why? Because there's no conflict left to justify the withdrawal anymore, no chaos to blame, no pressure to escape from, no emotional intensity left to run from. Only absence. And absence has a strange way of revealing the truth with brutal clarity. The avoidant person is left completely alone with themselves, alone with the memories, alone with the patterns, alone with the quiet awareness that someone loved them deeply and eventually walked away, not because they were impossible to love, but because the relationship itself had become impossible to survive emotionally. That distinction really matters. The empath didn't leave because the avoidant person was unworthy of love. They left because love without emotional safety slowly turns into self-abandonment. And eventually, self-respect becomes stronger than attachment ever could. This is the part many people misunderstand about deeply empathic people. They assume empaths are endlessly tolerant, endlessly forgiving, endlessly available no matter what. But true empaths eventually transform. After enough pain, enough emotional inconsistency, enough disappointment, something inside them finally awakens. They begin recognizing that their compassion was never meant to become a prison they couldn't leave. They stop trying to rescue people who refuse to take accountability. They stop romanticizing emotional unavailability. They stop quietly confusing suffering with loyalty. And once that transformation truly happens, they become incredibly difficult to manipulate emotionally. Not because they've turned cold, but because they've finally learned the real difference between understanding someone and sacrificing themselves completely for someone. That single lesson changes the entire trajectory of their life going forward. The avoidant person often experiences this transformation as a loss of control, but in reality, it's simply the empath reclaiming themselves, reclaiming their emotional energy, reclaiming their peace, reclaiming their standards, reclaiming all the parts of themselves that had slowly disappeared while trying to maintain an impossible emotional dynamic. And the most painful part for the avoidant person is this: the empath often still loves them even as they leave. That's exactly what makes the departure so powerful. It isn't indifference, it's self-preservation. The empath walks away not because their feelings simply vanished overnight, but because they finally understand that feelings alone are never enough to sustain a truly healthy relationship. Love without consistency hurts. Love without communication hurts. Love without emotional safety hurts. Love without accountability hurts. And eventually, even the deepest heart realizes it can't keep bleeding just to prove how devoted it is. So the empath walks away peacefully. Not because it's easy, but because staying has finally become harder than leaving. And the avoidant person feels the emotional weight of that decision deeply, even if they never admit it out loud to anyone. Because somewhere inside, they know this person gave chances most people never would have given. They know they were seen with extraordinary compassion. They know someone kept looking past their walls again and again, trying to reach the real person hidden underneath. And now that person is simply gone. Not angrily, not dramatically, not vengefully, just quietly gone. That kind of absence echoes especially loudly for someone who has spent their whole life suppressing emotional truth. The avoidant person might distract themselves afterward. They might appear completely unaffected on the surface. They might bury themselves in work, routines, distractions, new connections, or emotional numbness. But internally, the loss often lingers in ways they can't easily put into words. Because that empath represented something genuinely rare: safe love. Not perfect love, not easy love, but safe love. The kind of love that tried to understand instead of condemn. And losing that forces a confrontation that many avoidant people spend years trying desperately to escape, a confrontation with themselves. They begin seeing their own patterns more clearly now: the push and pull dynamics, the self-sabotage, the fear of intimacy quietly disguised as independence, the emotional withholding, the inability to fully receive love without instinctively fearing it. And sometimes this growing awareness becomes the true beginning of real healing. Not because the empath stayed and fixed them, but because the empath left and finally forced real reflection. That's exactly why a peaceful departure can be so transformative. It removes all distraction. It removes the emotional games. It removes the illusion that avoidance somehow comes without consequences. For perhaps the first time, the avoidant person understands that emotional safety isn't some infinite resource people will keep offering no matter how they behave, and whether they heal from this afterward depends entirely on them. Some people in this position finally choose growth. They seek out real support or therapy. They confront old childhood wounds. They begin learning genuine emotional vulnerability. They stop running from intimacy altogether. Others retreat even further into avoidance, quietly repeating the same old cycles with new people, while secretly carrying unresolved grief over the connection they lost. But regardless of which path they choose, the empath's departure changes them permanently. Because certain people leave a kind of emotional fingerprint on the soul, and the empath leaves behind one final, lasting lesson. Love should never require abandoning yourself just to keep someone else comfortable inside their own dysfunction. That lesson becomes sacred once it's truly learned. The empath eventually comes to understand that being needed is not the same thing as being cherished. Being understood is not the same thing as being chosen consistently. And loving someone deeply does not mean accepting emotional starvation indefinitely. So they stop trying to convince people to meet them halfway. Instead, they begin walking toward relationships where mutual effort exists naturally, where communication stays open, where affection isn't withheld as some kind of protection, where vulnerability isn't punished, where consistency replaces confusion, and perhaps most importantly, where love finally feels peaceful instead of emotionally exhausting. This is the final transformation of the true empath. They stop viewing love as something that has to be earned through suffering. And once that shift happens, everything changes for them. Their standards rise, their intuition sharpens, their boundaries grow stronger, their sense of self-worth stabilizes completely. They no longer chase after emotionally unavailable people hoping to heal them through sheer devotion. Instead, they choose relationships where genuine emotional presence already exists from the start. And ironically, that's often exactly when the avoidant person finally realizes what they truly lost. Not because the empath was perfect, but because the empath offered something increasingly rare in this world: a genuine heart. A heart willing to understand. A heart willing to stay. A heart willing to love far beyond the surface, right up until staying would have required betraying itself. And the moment a true empath finally refuses to betray themselves any longer, the entire dynamic collapses completely. The avoidant person can no longer rely on emotional distance as a form of power. They can no longer assume unconditional emotional access whenever they want it. They can no longer avoid the natural consequences of their own patterns, because the empath is finally, truly gone. Not emotionally reactive, not broken, not begging, just peaceful. And that peace says absolutely everything that needs to be said. It says, I loved you deeply. I understood you deeply. But I finally love myself enough to stop abandoning myself for you. For the avoidant ego, there is no louder message than that. Because in the end, what shattered the illusion was never anger. It was simply the empath's quiet decision to choose themselves. And sometimes, that becomes the very moment both people finally begin seeing the truth clearly for the first time. If any part of this story touched something inside you tonight, sit with it gently for a moment. And remember that choosing yourself is never an act of cruelty. It's an act of survival. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end. If this gave you something to think about, you already know what to do. And I'll see you in the next one. Take care of that beautiful, generous heart of yours.